we're going to go ahead and get started to be respectful of everybody's time. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jessica Kochlow. I'm the Executive Director here with Shenandoah National Park Trust. And our mission is to make strategic investments in Shenandoah that enhance, protect, and preserve Shenandoah's natural and cultural resources for today and for future generations. We fund a wide variety of projects and programs within the park. We probably touch every aspect that the visitor sees and many parts of the park that you don't see. That includes funding about 95% of the education programming in the park. That supports about 10,000 young people getting into the educate into what we call a living classroom. Trail maintenance, overlook clearing. We're right in the middle of a historic renovation of a boulder cabin, which is up in Skyland. It's one of the original structures before the park was formed. And we do a lot more. But tonight we're going to talk about a project that we're really excited about that we have been supporting for about a year and a half now, I guess a year. Shaleigh, you've been with us for a year. It is our Indigenous Cultural our Indigenous Cultural Landscape study report. It's been changed a little initiative. And this project got started as a way from the park to learn more about the Indigenous culture within the park and to document the historical aspects of the Indigenous culture in the park. And it's moved on to a much broader scope than just historical documentation. And Shaleigh and Vicky are going to talk about that project and how it's kind of transformed itself from what we initially thought this project was going to be. And for us, the really exciting part of this is this work will shape interpretation at the park. It has it has the ability to shape the stories that are told in the park, and just so much more. And maybe in the future, open up relationships more with the Monacan Nation and Shenandoah National Park. So we're really excited to be part of this project in a small way, and most excited to introduce you to Shaleigh Howells, who is our Indigenous Cultural Landscape Research Fellow with the Trust, who is focusing on cultural and historical preservation, stakeholder engagement, and advocacy for place-based Indigenous knowledge systems. Shaleigh is also the founder and principal consultant of River to Riches Consulting, a relationship-centered firm specializing in culturally grounded, community-driven approaches to cultural resources, management, interpretation, and conservation. Through this work, they collaborate with Native nations, public agencies, and community organizations to advance cultural sovereignty, heritage preservation, and environmental stewardship. Shaleigh is a Virginia Master Naturalist with the Roanoke Valley chapter and ambassador of the Girls Who Hike Virginia. Originally from Berkshires of Massachusetts, they have resided in Virginia for over a decade and hold a degree from Massachusetts College, can't say it right, of Liberal Arts and Harvard University. Our co-presenter is Victoria Ferguson, is an enrolled citizen of the Monacan Indian Nation of Virginia and is a graduate of Marshall University. Victoria has a background in researching science methodologies to support historical information and has spent 30 years seeking first-person documentation and archaeological information to help and explain and support theories on daily living habits of the Eastern Siouan populations up through the early European colonization period. She has written and presented work at Virginia Tech, Washington and Lee, Sweetbriar College, and James Madison University, and a number of archaeological conferences. You may glimpse her in two PBS documentaries, Virginia Indians Reclaiming Our Heritage and Pocahontas Revealed. She currently serves as a program director for Historic Solitude for Action on the campus of Virginia. Thank you for both being here tonight and setting stage and sharing the vision behind the Monacan Indigenous Cultural Landscape project. This project is a collaborative effort between the Monacan Indian Nation, the National Park Service, and the Shenandoah National Park Trust. So as we move into this conversation, I do want to let the audience know that this work is ongoing. There's not a document yet. This has really been focusing on the relationship building, the listening, and really laying the groundwork for the research. So we won't really be sharing the findings yet, though we do hope to maybe present on that next year once the work wraps up. We have received a lot of wonderful, thoughtful questions from our audience tonight, and we are going to be weaving those into our discussion. And I believe, if I'm correct, Molly, they can chat if they have more questions. Maybe I'm making that up. All right, so I'm just going to jump in. So for those of all of us who are probably pretty new to this work, except for our two wonderful speakers, what does Indigenous cultural landscape mean in this project's context? And Shaleigh, I'll let you start.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jessica. I appreciate it. Good evening, everybody. Hope you all are doing well, and thanks for joining us. So under this project, the Indigenous Cultural Landscape refers to more than just the physical land itself. We're also talking about the many connections that the Monacan people have with it. That includes forests, rivers, valleys, and other spaces that carry both historical, cultural, and spiritual significance. At the same time, these landscapes are connected to ongoing needs and priorities of Indigenous communities, including Monacan Indian Nation. They hold stories, knowledge, and cultural practices, and they are places where people such as the Monacan people can continue to live, visit, and maintain a relationship with the land today. These landscapes reflect both history and contemporary life, supporting traditions, cultural practices, and recognition of Indigenous presence in the Shenandoah Valley. For this project, an Indigenous cultural landscape is a combination of place, history, culture, and living relationships. It shows that the land is not just where people have lived in the past, but it's a vital part of who they are and how their community continues to thrive today.
Wonderful. So why is this work so important for both the Monacan Nation and for how people understand Shenandoah National Park today? And I'll start with you, Vicki.
Well, let's start with, as we said, like the Indigenous cultural landscape of Virginia's interior. And for me, it can best be described in two phases. The first and earliest phase is for us is like that nomadic phase from Paleo and Archaic periods. And then the second is the sedentary phase, which of course begins in the Woodland period. And I saw the nomadic phase as that time of discovery, learning unfamiliar places and new natural resources and all of those things that are going to contribute to survival. But the knowledge that was refined over those thousands of years was passed along as the cultures evolved. And those evolving practices contribute to that sustained survival. And many of those little snippets of information continue to be passed down even into recent times and recent our current generations with things that we know about those natural resources. And so having said that, I think that as a tribal citizen, I believe that our ancestors and our past, that type of knowledge belongs to us, the living descendants of the culture. And these cultures have to be honored and respected according to tribal customs and traditions. So many of our tribal citizens, many of them would prefer our knowledge remain within our Indigenous communities and have more control over what is shared with the public. So the tribe will have historical facts that we want the general public to know to improve understanding of our past and our present. And history can include topics like what language was spoken, what was the original territory during the early days of colonization, how was the land used, historical impacts. Those kinds of things are some of the things that we would be able to work with groups in order to tell those stories. And the use of tribal research and knowledge will depend really for us on the programs and the exhibit at the site that the tribes have agreed to work on in a collaborative manner.
So interesting and exciting.
Yeah.
Why, Shaleigh, do you think the trust decided to take on? Why was this something the trust decided to take on as part of the Indigenous initiative, and why now?
I know we have a lot of we in our meetings sometimes we have a lot of acronyms and we have a lot of hard many named titles for things. So I feel you right here on that. Kind of just to give everybody a little bit of a scope. So the trust took on this work to provide dedicated support for the Indigenous cultural landscape research and interpretation. This came out of a project proposal and funding request from Shenandoah National Park's Natural and Cultural Resources Unit. So these projects, which obviously, as we've discussed, document Indigenous histories, center tribal knowledge, and connect Indigenous communities through other pathways of consultation with the park. These all kind of interwovenly affect park planning, and they a lot of times require additional resources and capacity. So through the Indigenous Initiative, the Trust has been able to provide funding, staff support, and expertise needed to carry out this type of work in a way that's thoughtful and collaborative with Native nations. So as the ICL Research Fellow, I come in with experience working across both tribal and governmental sectors, helping bridge perspectives, strengthen partnerships, and ensure the project is carried out, obviously, in a way that's efficient and sustainable. So this approach really builds on long-term capacity, both for the park, but also for Indigenous partners. So kind of in short, the project addresses a real need by supporting work that is important, but does not always have a formal home or avenue for dedicated resources within the National Park Service. And at the same time, it also lays a strong foundation for collaboration in future Indigenous-led projects within Shenandoah.
Great. With the research process formally beginning, what does this space kind of look like, and what are you focusing on right now?
The question we get all the time. So this is the number one question I've gotten, and I know a lot of our project partners have gotten. So right now, what we are focusing on is gathering the background, kind of different knowledge and materials that can help us really understand the landscape and its history. At the same time, what we're also doing is prioritizing stakeholder engagement. So meeting with citizens of Monacan Indian Nation through interviews, discussion, we'll be doing park tours. These conversations make sure that their knowledge, their perspectives, and their priorities guide every step of the way in the work that we're doing. We're also starting the reporting process right now. So I've been working to outline the structure of the report, determining who will write the different sections from some of our core partners who are working on the project, and also identifying editors and reviewers. One thing that I really wanted to kind of note in this setting, and I think is really important, all core project partners on this project will be listed as authors on the final ICL report. Additionally, all Monacan citizens, as well as other stakeholders and partners that we've worked with, will be recognized as contributors. All of this emphasizing how collaborative this work and this process has been, and from my perspective, how it should be when we're doing these types of projects. The goal is to produce a report that provides guidance, so for future interpretation, planning, consultation, and stewardship within the park. And it also that is meaningful and it's valuable not only for the National Park Service, but also for Monacan Indian Nation and potentially down the line for other nations as this process potentially expands.
So, Vicki, when you think about a report being produced, right? And while Shaylee's wonderful and has a lot of history and knowledge in doing this, she's still sort of coming from the National Park Service's
Right.
lens, and which, is it's a valid, that's the lens in which we're viewing it. But how do you kind of help or see the Monacan Nation helping sort of guide the principles and your guys' values, and how that sort of shapes the kind of what the product, the end
Right.
result? I don't even, it's not even, it's
Yeah.
really the beginning, hopefully, but this guiding document that's gonna hopefully move a lot more work forward.
Well, I've actually given this quite a bit of thought, and not speaking for, all of the members of the tribe, but from the way that I approach things, I think the report that we're working on should cover the procedures for working through concerns from a tribal perspective. And when I say that, I think a good place for us to start is cultural competencies. A foundational learning experience with the concept of cultural competency is understanding, of course, the need to build relationships. We always remind people that asking and not telling is the best initial approach. Research must come after relationship building. And the tribe doesn't feel like that conversations are all centered on the mining of data. What do you know that you can tell us, right? So making sure that that's not how the conversations or relationships goes. Once a relationship is developed, one way to approach the planning process for the park or museums or other groups who might read this and want to use this as a foundation is for us to say, let's have some ideas of things you would like to work on and that you would like to have us involved as you work on, whether it's an exhibit, a program, a presentation, whatever these things are. And through conversations with the tribe, you can kind of ascertain if the tribe really has the bandwidth at that time to work through the project. It'll allow the tribe the opportunity to choose which programs or presentations or exhibit that they want to be a part of, and then start to develop a timeline for that. And so for me, laying out those things as part of how we would approach this would be important.
Great, thank you. All right, Vicki, this is another question, and this is actually from one of our listeners. And this is a question I've even heard and is being a little bit engaged in this process. Where were the settlements?
Oh yeah,
at this early stage, how are you guys thinking about approaching this sort of place-based knowledge in a respectful and collaborative way before any documentation or mapping in it begins? Right. How does that work?
One thing that I like to point out that we've been working on at Virginia Tech is a map of Eastern Samoan territory. And the map is dated circa 1650. So it's the time period that you're really starting to see Europeans cross over the fall line and move into the Piedmont, the Blue Ridge, and beyond. And so for us to have this map that looks at the mid-Atlantic part of the state to outline territory of these Eastern Samoan speakers, to me, is great. When we were developing the map and we were working with, archaeologists, our map makers, historians, and all these groups of people, the tribe decided that the marks that are on the map would not be an exact position for the towns, where the town was, where mounds were. And the reason why is because today we have issues with people who like to go looking for artifacts. They like to dig artifacts and mine artifacts. And so for us, actually giving you the exact place to go to see where that settlement or that town or that village was often results in people thinking that they can go and dig for. We hear it all the time, oh, we want an arrowhead, So for us, that becomes something that we don't really want to share. So And it goes beyond just where the settlements are for us. It starts with acquiring the tribe's opinion on our cultural knowledge, what we may be willing to share, and what we see as a big no. So to start things off with, like we're not going to teach you ceremonies. That's a big no. Like I said, the exact locations of our former towns or burial mounds, no. That information really needs to be protected. We don't want to talk about health disparities. Those conversations are really better managed by the tribes, as research and use of statistics can be a part of that and told from the tribal narrative. And also that conversation around DNA. So there are some things we know are big no's, which that includes with where the actual settlements were. So I can show you the map of where our territory was without pinpointing down that place that you would go to dig for projectile points or arrowheads, as people say. And that's kind of like how we approach that.
That's makes perfect sense. Shaleigh, how about you?
Thank you. Yeah, so coming a little bit from a different perspective, as both Vicki and kind of Jessica have already alluded to. So kind of looking at things from a research perspective, we're starting by recognizing that where the settlements are isn't a geographic question. It's a cultural one when we are working in these spaces. So before we're doing any kind of mapping or documentation happens, the first step is, as we've already talked about, really building relationships and listening to the Monacan community about how they understand place, how they understand movement and connections within these landscapes, much as Vicki just described. I think the other thing too, I want to kind of pivot to, that goes back to the last question, talking about, some of these things that are important as guiding principles for producing a report and shaping values in that. One thing that we took a lot of time at the beginning of this project to do was to set out methodologies for the work that we're doing, to set out a data sovereignty agreement, to set out framing for the report. All of this was done in consultation with our core partners, and with of which 7 are Monacan citizens. So, that's a big part of this kind of all of this process here. So in practical terms, what all of that really means is, for this question, kind of beginning with, again, conversation rather than coordinates, learning what knowledge the Monacan Indian Nation feels comfortable publicly sharing, what should remain within the community, and how places are remembered through stories, family histories, and lived experience. Again, we're going to be doing those interviews and those place-based tours within Shenandoah. We're also thinking carefully about what settlement actually means from an Indigenous perspective. So rather than looking for only fixed village sites, as would typically come up in this conversation, we're also considering broader patterns of seasonal use, travel routes, and cultural spaces that don't always show up on modern maps, or creating today's system of identifying and inventorying place. So looking at things a little bit differently. So only after those kind of shared priorities and permissions are in place do we actually even turn to these types of tools, such as archives and mapping. And again, this is all guided by Monacan leadership and our core partners in these conversations. The goal in the end is to make sure the relationship leads the research and not the other way around. When I come in and we're having conversations, I'm not the one pushing for certain research avenues. We're having conversations with our community partners on what they want to learn in this process too. So it's not only meeting NPS priorities, it's also meeting our community partner priorities too.
So Vicki, kind of following up with Shaleigh and, the conversations with the Monacan Nation. And so as you guys are sort of in these conversations, how do you kind of see the Monacan voices and how the nation's priorities kind of shaping what questions get asked around this project? And maybe even more importantly, what doesn't get asked, right? Like, kind of back to the, what do we talk about? What do we don't talk about?
Well, we understand that many questions can be asked And we also understand that not all of them can be answered. That's just how that is. Um, the tribe, or for me, for instance, I like to work with an entity to develop a presentation or exhibit. And in doing that, I like to do something and where I feel that the tribe feels like it's an important information for the general public to know. Okay. And it's often it will focus on correcting false narratives. You probably hear things all the time. Okay. So some of the work that we might want to have part of the story being told is that we are correcting some false narratives of the past. The tribe may not want to have all of the knowledge that they have extracted. And that's just something that the tribe and conversations will work around. This action places us in a space where very often we don't want to feel like all of our data is being mined. We just want to feel like we can give you what you need to do your presentations or to do your exhibits or have these conversations, but there will be some parts of this that the tribe will feel like they will retain for their own benefit, for their own self. The tribe may not want to provide, like I said, an in-depth, limitless quality of historical documentation, and it's better to outline a pathway for the inception of an idea. So that's what we're looking at. How do we develop a pathway for the inception of the idea and then the completion of the work? And that includes steps for us to protect and preserve knowledge in a manner that the tribe will feel comfortable with. And so these things can meet in the middle. We can still provide information. We can help develop, presentations, programs, exhibits, and things like that. And at the same time, not feel like every little teeny thing that we would know or we've done is out there in a public place. And so it's going to be a balance of how we work and shape the priorities that the tribe will have in order to meet the requests that we're getting from the entity we're working with.
All right, another listener question. And they asked about next steps. What would you say is the most meaningful milestone that needs to happen before public sharing or interpretation begin? And I'll let you answer first, Vicki.
Okay. Well, I think the thing I said is that building relationships. And I think that's something that Shaleigh talked about earlier of having meetings and sitting down and asking questions and getting people who want to be involved and try to build relationships. From that relationship with the tribe, then you can request to collaborate with them. And so we have some different things here when I use the word collaborate that people may not think about. So the 7 tribes in Virginia who are federally recognized, there are times when collaboration moves beyond just collaboration and consent, but it moves to consultation. And that depends on what entity we're working with. So if we're working government to government, then these conversations become tribal consultations where it's different. It's really, written down like the agreements we have when we're going through archaeological digs in NAGPRA and all these kinds of things. So there's that part of it. But when we're working with entities that are not federal government, the consultation conversation does not come into effect, but collaboration becomes the thing that remains on the table. And with collaboration to the tribe also comes with consent. So that's a part of this thing that we're working with. For us, sometimes the specific programs will want to maybe narrow the scope of what that conversation or what that program is going to be about. And that's something that we will do internally as we're working with these groups before the information is shared. We would like for the groups we're working with really to take the information from the planning session and then begin maybe with tribal consultants or people in the tribe that the tribe has said, yes, we want you to work with these people. That's another important thing about it, because you can't just call up anybody and go, hey, can you do this? You know, the tribe should encourage who they want to have involved in that conversation, right? So that's one of the steps that we're going to take. And then you can start to begin that first iteration of the program or the exhibit or what you want to do. But that's only the first step, because then after you work through that, then we're going to expect that the information comes back to us as tribal consultants, and that we'll review it and then be able to make comments, suggest changes, properly document that information from the tribal's perspective, get it back to the entity we're working with. Sometimes that may happen a couple of times before we get to a place that we all feel comfortable what it is. And then and only then will we feel comfortable with releasing the narrative the tribe has agreed to. So there's a lot of steps that people don't think about that developing these exhibits or programs or presentations are going to go through, just to get it to the place where we're comfortable with the public, the general public, getting this information. So it's a lot, I know, right? And Kaylee's shaking her head like, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it
Shaleigh, I'm
is,
sorry.
but it's, you know, it's an honor. It's such an honor to be able to be in that circle and being able to share that information in any way that the tribe agrees to, right? Like, it's truly an honor to be part of that.
Mhm.
All right, so Shaleigh, from the research perspective, would you say the most meaningful milestone is?
Yeah, Vicki pointed out a lot. I liked this question, and I knew we'd have some kind of back and forth play here in our answer. So for me as a researcher, I think the most meaningful kind of milestone in terms of public sharing or interpretation, that public facing kind of element, is a completely and fully vetted report that has been carefully reviewed and approved, as Vicki kind of outlined, via Monacan Indian Nation and our project partners. I think that moving through this kind of full cycle of documentation, analysis, and collaborative review ensures that what's being presented is accurate, respectful, and obviously reflects Monacan perspectives, as well as the research findings that we collectively find through this process. I think one thing that's important too, as Vicki was kind of talking about consultation, for this project, when I think of consultation and working in the tribal sector, if anybody's on here that does, you think of like big C consultation, little c consultation. So while this project is not tied to formal consultation under Section 106, NEPA, et cetera, we have been kind of managing the project in a more formal way, on kind of a little bit more of that big C, working with our federal partners. We do have NPS staff from Shenandoah National Park that are part of the core project partners group that work on this. So just wanted to kind of give a little more info around that, because I think that is important, as Vicki was kind of talking about, kind of that distinction. Well, the park does not have to do this process for this project. It is something that we are taking on and making sure that we're doing because it is a meaningful way to engage with Monacan Indian Nation. I think practically, this whole thing of kind of coming up with a final report and having all this vetting really just means a lot of feedback, multiple rounds of feedback. So making sure that cultural context within the report is represented properly, that sensitive information is handled appropriately, redacted, etc., according to whatever our tribal partners want in that process, and that the language and framing are accessible to the public. But in that process, also not losing meaning or integrity of all of the work that we've kind of done and put together. I will kind of put out there that the focus on accessibility has been a major kind of conversation and goal under this project. We are working to kind of shift what the standard is for how Indigenous cultural landscape reports and projects are typically approached and how they're implemented. So once the final report is in place, our goal is to have it become a trusted foundation for a lot of the elements that Vicki was talking about for exhibition development, for educational materials that can be distributed to the public, and obviously too for other areas of park interpretation. So basically, at the end, anything that the public encounters is grounded both in rigorous research and community approval. And so having that pairing is really important, rather than just being, a preliminary or a partial kind of narrative that's been kind of put together that we may have seen in other spaces in the past.
So kind of moving on to once we get past that big project and milestone and it's done, and then we have this big 300-page National Park Service manual, because I feel like that's what they all are, National Park Service, even when Shaleigh and Vicki are working hard to make it different. I know the goal is different, but I do know that they do love their manuals. How do you hope that this project will eventually change? Because, a lot of how the trust thinks about work, and of course the National Park Service, it's their mission, is really from that visitor perspective. And I want to talk about that. And then I do want to come back after this question, Vicki, and ask you a little bit from the Monacan Nation sort of experience kind of past this. But let's focus on the visitor. So what do you hope this project will change, kind of eventually change on how the visitor experiences Shenandoah National Park? I think there's definitely more to the park than 1937, whatever it was, 27. We're in the 90th year this year. So, Vicki, why don't you start?
Well, I would like to, and I'm not saying the park isn't doing this already. I'm not doing that, but we should want our parks to have a better, more realistic presentations, right? And I think the relationship with the tribe will provide the opportunity for that to happen in a number of different ways. For instance, having the Aboriginal technologist who can come and notice, I didn't say primitive technologists, I said Aboriginal technologists. We are rephrasing that because we found out a long time ago, as when you say primitive technologists, sometimes you just think of people hitting rocks together or something, and these technologies are much more refined than that. And so but the opportunity for these Aboriginal technologists to share their crafts, or artists to do their work and share that knowledge with the public, while allowing our local American Indian to have ownership of their history and culture, and then that key component of preservation of the culture, history, knowledge of the natural resources. All of those things, we would like to see them become a constant theme in the programming. And it's going to take time. These things don't happen like overnight, but they're, and especially for this park, because this park has like stuff from 4,500 years ago, right? So it goes a really, really long time, even before the woodland period, or people are living there, living in the region or using that region. And so being able to have these timelines for people to say, this place has had occupation for all of these centuries, because sometimes people don't understand just how long ago that silt was made, or things like that. So for us, that really realistic presentation that allows people to really think. I remember one time I was doing some research on bridging programs, and that's really what I think about when I think about this. Is what we're doing is we're bridging programs. We're bridging knowledge from this group to knowledge with this group, and we're bridging it so we can tell a more complete story, so the story isn't told just from one side or one perspective. But I was doing the research, and it happens to come up that one of the national parks had been, taking people on hikes and doing these walks, and it never occurred to them to reach out to the local Indian tribe and say, you know, come work here, or come be here, or come share these things. And for this particular group, it just happened to be the Nez Perce. And so they were able to figure out that by working with them, how it improved their ability to tell that story, to get the information out. And so the parks were gaining information from that perspective. But the interesting part of it was the Nez Perce said that when they first entered into it, how they felt like it worked as long as they were able to shape the stories in the way that the dominant culture wanted these stories to be told. And so what we have an opportunity to do here is to not allow the stories to only be shaped in the former fashion that the dominant culture would have them to be told, but be shaped by a narrative that has more input from Indigenous people from the region.
That's great. And Shaleigh, from your perspective, what do you hope? How do you hope this will change it?
little delay in the mute button. So a lot of the things that Vicki talked about, obviously, from my perspective, one thing that I really hope kind of comes out of this project and projects like this is that it helps visitors experience Shenandoah not just as a natural and beautiful space, but as a living landscape with, as Vicki pointed to, really deep cultural presence and history. So instead of seeing, the story where the creation of the park began as a national park, I hope that people have a little bit more of a longer kind of understanding of the longer relationship that Monacan people and other Indigenous communities have with the land that we're kind of working with under this report. I think ideally too, this would show up in kind of small but very meaningful ways, potentially through, as Vicki was talking about, interpretation, programs, digital resources. All of these things invite visitors to ask, their own questions, to think more deeply about the spaces that they occupy, and the ways that they move through them, just as people always have. I think right now, too, something that, is important, and, Vicki really hit right on the head, is that, there's limited funding and capacity right now across all sectors and across the board. And so being able to pair a lot of these initiatives with tribal goals and tribal programming and things that are already in place that can be, again, shared or replicated or utilized. Anyone who has worked with me knows I do not like to reinvent the wheel. So if there are already good things in place, why aren't we kind of boosting those and putting more effort in those areas? So that's something that we're also looking at is, what is the Monacan Indian Nation already doing really well for programming? Where are some things that we can, support potentially down the line, other areas to have more collaboration with the park in those spaces? Another thing that I really hope it does is that I hope it encourages more of a sense of responsibility in visitors. So again, shifting from just enjoyment of the park to actually reflecting on how their presence connects to kind of larger histories, to communities that are throughout Shenandoah Valley, and whether there are opportunities for meaningful shifts in how they relate to these places within their own lives and within their own activities when they're in the park. I think in that way, the experience becomes less about passing through and passing by information and more about really understanding kind of the landscape and where it's at today, but also where it's been in the past too.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of shift a little bit, and this is back to like the Monacan Nation's kind of what you guys kind of, what the tribe, and I know you don't speak for the tribe, but you know,
Not everybody.
being a part of this experience and being one of the members of the tribe of like, I mean, I think one of the things about these cultural landscapes is they provide this maybe this one will do it, a way to sort of challenge kind of the traditional way that land is kind of managed and defined by NPS and kind of reshaping that. And I think that does come through the interpretation and and that's a really the visitor's experience. But, taking it back to the tribe's experience of, sort of, your ancestral lands and how can this landscape can redefine that relationship, hopefully, or maybe, or, it's a big question that I didn't prepare you for, by the way. But I've learned over this experience, and I'm rambling a little bit, like one that was, I never really thought of as like, and this is just my own naivety and probably a lot of people's of like, we know it kind of contextually, but the reality is it's a nation to nation relationship. And like that is sometimes conflictual and tension, and there's some tension there, right? And this study can maybe helpfully move that relationship in a way that maybe can change some of that. But anyways, I'm reflecting on.
Yeah, I've kind of thought about how what I would like the report to actually do.
Yeah.
And it's not that I would want a report that goes, okay, well, we know that this particular forest has, these kinds of trees, and let's check off the ways that Indigenous people use these trees, and that kind of stuff. We may get to that, okay, but there's the work that has to be done in order for us to get to that, and that's what I would like to focus on really for this. And it's really based around how we approach the work with the tribe, rather than focusing on just gathering the historical knowledge that it's going to be categorized and then stored in a place sometimes outside of our tribal library. So that's not what would be an optimum thing for us. But how we approach the work, that's the thing that I think could be the foundation for other people once they get the report and see what they're doing. I would not want the tribe to feel like that people are coming to pick our brains or just to acquire our information. And we know that we've had promises that, information will be protected, and the tribal, conversation around data sovereignty is there, and that is important. But there will be shared knowledge, there will be programs developed, but understanding that the tribe will have greater control over what is shared, to what extent the information is used for the public presentations. And the report should really cover the procedure for working through the concerns with the tribal perspective. And that's what I mean when I say we're going to set the foundation of how Shaleigh worked with the tribe, what worked for her, what she's going to suggest that we have on the books for other people to do when they come into the question of working with us as Monacans, but then carrying that to other tribes. Now, other tribes may have slightly different variations on how they want that program to work. So one thing doesn't fit, but having a good initial report that's going to lay down some of the foundations of how to work through this, to me, is the first step, or the one thing that we'd want to do on the Indigenous Cultural Landscape report.
Great. Shaleigh, how do you see this report not being the 300-page brick that sits on the desk?
Well, I'll say Vicki and I are very, very, very much aligned. So like Vicki, I hope that this process, not only the report, but this process as a whole, is, does more than extract and record information. And that's something we've talked about in our partner meetings. I hope it sets a new precedence for how, not only how Indigenous cultural landscape reports are, but other types of projects at this level, how that they're approached and how they're shared. So, rather than being, as you just alluded to, Jessica, these kind of traditional, heavily academic centered projects and reports, kind of looking to design, projects that are more action oriented. So with practical recommendations under this umbrella that can guide how the National Park Service implements changes and interprets these landscapes. The report, I think the most important piece here, and this is how, in my professional opinion, it should be for all of these projects, is the report is meant first for the Monacan Indian Nation. So reflecting their perspectives, their authority, and their priorities. Additionally, under this project, the nation owns all the research and materials that are related to this project. So that is something that we took on that we felt was an important initiative under this project, and that is a part of our data sovereignty agreement, is that Monacan Indian Nation owns the rights to everything produced under this project. So that, I think, is not always done in a lot of spaces, but again, was something that we out of the gate wanted to make sure. So everything that is put together in the database that we are creating at the end of this project, it gets transferred to Monacan Indian Nation. This is even materials that aren't included potentially in the final report too. I think, in addition to obviously the report serving and being meant first for Monacan, it's also intended to serve as a model for NPS, for other Native nations, for researchers, and obviously too the public. There's people in the public, and many of you seated here today, that are interested in this type of work, on how the ICL can be done again in a more responsible and more ethical and a much and important to our work under this project in a more accessible way. I think ideally, it would be used by partners across the board for planning. Again, we've talked about interpretation, we've talked about education, a lot of these same areas that we're centered on. I think, too, additionally, this project can serve as a model for others to follow when approaching similar projects. The goal here is to show that Indigenous-led collaboration, practical implementation, and accessibility can come together to produce a report that's not just read, again, but something that's actually used to make meaningful change across all of these different partners that we're working with.
Do you see this as an, well, let me step back. I mean, Shenandoah is a natural resource park, right? That's its jam, bread and butter. Do you see this report potentially influencing land management decisions in the national parks or surrounding public lands? Do you see that, or is it just mainly focused on the more interpretive stuff?
From my perspective, based on our preliminary conversations with core partners, this extends beyond just public-facing interpretation, very much so. We're talking about potentially conversations around co-stewardship, co-management of different land spaces. We've had a lot of conversation that things that the general public, if they were implemented, may not see. These are, some of the things that we're talking about and developing. I think last count, and this is just a kind of a side note, that we have, I think, about 12 things already, without even giving heavily into the report build out, that have been mentioned in our core partner conversations that could be implemented actions by NPS. And I think of that, not even half are public facing things like interpretation and that.
And for us, if that's one of the areas that the park would want to go through this whole process of sitting down, we'd like, this is what we like to work. Let's fine tune where we're going to go with this. Let's, start to do the research, work through all of those steps. Then we could come at the end and have something that that would fit the needs of everybody. The park would be able to gather information that they've learned from Indigenous groups, but being able to say, well, this is the approach, this is the steps we want to take for each one of those ideas that you want to work through. That's why laying the foundation of how we're going to work through those and work through them one at a time will allow us to do those things, have conversations about the land, how we use the land, how, things like that, and have it to filter in. But I don't see it as something that we're going to be able to answer all of those questions at one time and not follow a process that we feel we need to have in order for it to work for us.
What I'm hearing from this conversation, my big takeaway is that this is a relationship, and this relationship doesn't end with this report. This is really the beginning of a beautiful partnership and relationship between the nation and the park, and hopefully that this work continues to evolve, right? And changes as this relationship evolves and changes. Well, it's suddenly almost 7:30. I know there's a few questions in the Q&A, and for those that we weren't able to get to, we will see if our panelists will answer them and we can get them out in an email, a follow-up email. They seem fairly questions that we can get back to you. So we will do that. Just look out for that email. Shaleigh, Vicki, any last words before we depart?
Well, I appreciate everyone being there. Quickly, yes, the Manahoacs are related to the Monacans. We're Eastern Siouan speakers, which means there's that cultural thing that we have together. So that's going to answer that question for you. But like I said, I look forward to us being able to outline the steps that we think that will work for us to do this. And like you said, it's going to be ongoing in order for us to work through all the different things that the park might want to work on.
Yeah, just to kind of pivot off of that, both Vicki's comments now and yours too, Jessica. I think what's important for the public to kind of know about this particular stage of the Indigenous initiative under the ICL that we're working on, like we are working to produce the report, and we are working under that report to put together some implementation recommendations. This phase of work does not actually include implementative work, both by project partners, NPS, etc. That's next stage, hopefully, of this process. So just something to think about, because that's a question I get asked a lot. We are working solely right now to build this recommendation report and putting this report together. The phase 2 is where does that report go and how does it actually become an actionable tool or instrument for all of the project partners.
Great. Well, thank you guys both for sharing so much about your hopes and what this project is, and answering some of my questions and probably some of the audience and some of the audience's questions. And just really appreciate you letting us into this process, and I look forward to sort of seeing the report and this ongoing conversation that I hope we get to have again. So thank you all for being on with us tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did, and please reach out if you have questions. Molly's the person. She can get you in touch with people. Anyways, thank you guys. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you all.
Bye.